here, Chris Fields in the corner.
Oh, it's a huge leg kick, and it's over!
Beautiful finish.
His debut was...
Oh, big shot from Ian Garry! It's over!
You called up! You called up!
The future, Ian Garry!
Ian Garry might not be your favorite fighter in the sport, but he definitely has the fans' attention. This Irish sensation has been one of Europe's biggest prospects for years now. And though his 6-0 UFC run has brought his talents to the attention of the masses, those who were in the know about this guy have been convinced of his talents for a long time. He's 25 years old, unbeaten as a pro, and ranked in the top 15 of the 170-pound division. And if there's one thing we've learned from this UFC run so far, it's that he's just getting better and better.
Spectacular. I mean, he timed that perfectly.
Ian Garry's remarkable run through Cage Warriors eventually led him to capturing promotional gold in the welterweight division with a solid performance over 5 rounds against Jack Grant. During his time in Cage Warriors and on the amateur scene, he had worked up one hell of a highlight reel, and most Europe-centric MMA fans were quick to point to him as a top prospect. When he finally got the call up to the UFC at 23 years old, the timing was just about as right as can be. Garry had left his gym in Dublin and recently moved to the United States. And with his first promotional title in the bag, a debut appearance against Jordan Williams seemed like the perfect way to introduce this long and rangy striker to the masses. Jordan Williams was not really expected to have much of a shot in there against Garry, but in the early exchanges he was really making his mark. Williams used Garry's style of leaning out of exchanges against him, doubling or even tripling up on strikes to catch the Irishman as he tried to get out of range.
He's in on a single.
All of a sudden, this unbeaten prospect was in bad shape, looking pretty one-dimensional in his defense. The commentators started to sense this, the fans started to sense it, and you better believe that Williams did too, so he began to press the offense. However, he likely made the mistake of underestimating just how dangerous this was against a fighter like Garry. And after a solid head kick landed, Garry regained some momentum, eventually catching Williams coming in with a smooth counter, dropping him and finishing the fight with a first-round TKO. It wasn't pretty, but it was a win, one that came with clear signs that Ian Garry needed to improve. Garry's second walk to the UFC octagon was one that certainly saw him come under quite a lot of scrutiny. After a less than impressive debut that was saved by one moment of magic, a lot of fans questioned just how much of that showing was nerves and how much of it stemmed from legitimate issues with his defense. Darian Weeks was his next opponent, and with a grinding style that seemed like it could pose problems, the key here for Ian Garry was to maintain his cool, and above all else, get the win. And that's what we saw here for the most part. This might have been the least noteworthy performance of Ian Garry's UFC run. It wasn't bad, and in the moments he showed off his stylish striking and very solid takedown defense. But by the time round 3 had ended, it wasn't like this young Irishman had set the world alight. This was a guy who was getting used to his new home in the UFC, a new gym in Sanford MMA, now named Kill Cliff FC. And though he didn't get the finish, he moved to 2-0 with a lot more confidence than his somewhat shaky debut. Next up for Ian Garry was the tough and highly stubborn Gabriel Green, a fighter that came with a style that was always going to test Garry's mettle, his composure, and his gas tank. Green wasn't going to set the world on fire with his technical skills, but that opening round, he set the pace early, putting massive amounts of pressure on the future by tucking his chin, raising his hands, and moving forward. Garry, to his credit, kept his cool throughout, pot-shotting through his opponent's defense through the opening 2 rounds, landing with his hands and his head kicks to stifle any type of momentum that Green was trying to build. Sure, Gabe had his moments, but overall, this was a showcase for Garry, as he dealt with the pressure and eventually used it against his opponent in the final round, dropping him and forcing him into a panic situation in those dying minutes. It wasn't a flashy performance, but trust us, those will follow. But for all intents and purposes, Ian Garry turned in a solid performance here to move to 3-0 in the UFC. Getting a spot on the prelims of a Jon Jones fight card under any circumstances is a big deal, but to get on that UFC 285 card ahead of Jones's heavyweight debut? Yeah, this was some skillful fight booking from the UFC brass. And while things looked good for Garry early, Keenan found home for a huge counter hook that rattled the Irishman in that first round. Was this highly regarded prospect about to be found out? Well, if you needed any proof of Garry's adaptability, it came in this fight. Keenan had tagged him, and it was proof that there were holes in his defense that might cost him if he wasn't careful. But in the remaining 2 rounds of this fight, we definitely saw just how well this guy can make reads, how well he can take a hint and make the correction adjustments. To put it simply, his performance in round 2 and especially round 3 took things to another level. If Keenan didn't drop him in the first, this might just have been his best performance to date. And by the time the final minutes came around, Garry was flowing, so much so that he was able to unleash a hellacious combo at the end of round 3. In that combo, he dodged the very same counter hook that dropped him in round 1 and proceeded to beat the brakes off Keenan for the TKO finish. It was a win that proved his grit and, above all other things, his ability to work his way out of trouble. If you're looking for the first legitimate, high-level test of Garry's career, sure, you could point to a few decent fights he has faced, even in Cage Warriors. But when he went up against the number 15 ranked Daniel Rodriguez, there was a real sense that this was a coming-of-age fight for the future. Rodriguez is uncoachable tough, gritty, and always willing to throw down with the right opponent. But all the way through fight week, Garry told the world that he was going to set D-Rod up for a highlight reel head kick finish.
This is the fall of Daniel Rodriguez.
And if anything else landed, it was not the intended result. As it turned out, Garry was bang on the money with his prediction, and in the very first round, he cracked Rodriguez's chin with extra style points, landing his head kick and finishing him with zero controversy.
This is going to be it. D-Rod covers up.
This, for many fans, was the moment that they started to take this Dublin native very, very seriously. And finally, we come to his most recent appearance, a grudge match with the tried and tested Neil Magny. He was originally scheduled for a top 10 debut against Jeff Neal, but an injury to Hands of Steel left Garry with the opponent he had originally asked for in Magny. Magny has always been a stern test, a guy who will most definitely find a way to beat you if you're not up to the task. Simply put, he's a gatekeeper. And for Garry, this was the perfect litmus test to see exactly where he stands with the 170-pound mix. And well, if that was the question, then the future proved that he is indeed as good as he says he is. Magny was totally outgunned from the get-go, beaten to every punch, totally ineffective in his offense and his defense.
Start to clinch me. That was one of the long side.
And as soon as Garry landed his first half kick, it really did spell trouble for Magny. Maybe a finish could have come, given just how damaged his opponent was, but it's hard to award anything less than a gold star to Ian Garry for this performance. Will Stephen Wonderboy Thompson be the next in line for this rising talent? Who knows? But if one thing's for certain, it's that Ian Garry is here to stay, and his fellow welterweights have every reason to be worried.